kids could marry, what kind of jobs you could get your kids with higher levels of nobility. Like, it was all about reputation. So fighting and winning duels for glory was a great way to build your reputation. However, compurgation was the only reason why duels were required. And if you were accused of something unjustly, then you had no choice. You had to fight it. And actually, we can go from there to Hans Talhofer, who offers 7 reasons to duel. And this is in the compurgation category. So if you are accused of one of these 7 things, then you must fight your accuser, or your honor is just gone. And that's murder, treason, heresy, disloyalty, betrayal in combat, falsehood, and rape. Now, this idea of duels for glory and duels for compurgation lead directly to the 2 formats for duels, which we have, which are generally called a duel to satisfaction or a duel to the extremity. And in Italian, that's ad piacenza and ad oltranza. In German, we have the concept of Schimpf and Ernst, which lines up fairly well with these 2 contexts. In a duel to satisfaction, you have very specific format and win conditions. So it's this kind of duel where you say, we will each strike, or we will go out and we will strike, 10 blows with the sword and 10 blows with the dagger and 10 blows with the axe, and then we're done. Or we're going to break 10 lances, and whoever gets the most lances broken on their opponent wins. So there's a clear start, a clear finish, and a clear process and win condition. A duel to the extremity is not like that. This is what you might have envisioned in your head with real dueling. This is where there's only 2 outcomes. Either somebody dies, or whoever made the accusation, or somebody has to recant, which either means they have to admit their accusation was false, or they have to admit that the accusation is true, depending on what side of that equation you're on. But your only options are to kill your opponent, or to basically surrender and acknowledge you were in the wrong. And those are the extremities of the duel. Otherwise, you keep fighting until that happens. And there's even provisions of like, okay, you get to the end of the day and that hasn't happened yet, so everybody goes home and come back the next day and you keep fighting. There's no other way for the duel to end. Once an accusation has been made, or not necessarily even an accusation for a duel to satisfaction, if just a challenge has been made, then there's a form you have to follow. He goes through and he gives this big explanation where you have to send an officer of the court or an officer of arms, and you have to send a gauntlet, which he calls the bloody gauntlet of battle. Which I quote this here because his rationale is interesting. We think of gloves as just like a thing that's involved in, you smack the guy or whatever. But he says you have to send a gauntlet because it's the piece of armor most worthy for defense. And without a gauntlet, you can't actually sword fight. Because finding his hand naked and stripped of the gauntlet, that is its armor, one cannot work securely in combat without fear of incurring detriment and damage. So if you send a guy your gauntlet, that means you're fucking serious. Because that's your most important piece of armor. Which is also funny because later on he's going to give you a hierarchy of armor, and the gauntlet is not at the top. For the purpose of this conversation, he's like, no. The gauntlet is your most important piece of armor. So you send him your gauntlet, and hopefully, I guess, maybe they're supposed to bring it back to you afterward. Like they just show him the gauntlet and then take it home, because you also need it. And that means you're serious. However, once the challenge is made, then the challenger decides everything. Because the challenger, the person giving the challenge is, or the plaintiff, I guess, in legal terms, he's the one that they consider to have forced the duel to happen. So the defendant didn't want to fight a duel, presumably. You could certainly find situations where someone provokes somebody else to challenge them because they want to be the defendant. Because they get to choose whatever weapons they want and impose any kind of restrictions on armaments. This is a picture from a tournament book where they're fighting with clubs on horseback in armor. You can decide, and you usually make those choices. You can basically stack the deck against your opponent. If you know anything about how he likes to fight or what he's good at, you can try and format a duel that puts him at every disadvantage. However, that only works for duels to satisfaction. Because if you are fighting a duel to the extremity, then all weapons of war are allowed. And he gives us many cases where there was an agreement involved about which weapons would be used, and that someone breaks the agreement, but because it's a duel to the extremity, there's no punishment, because why did you even agree to that? That's dumb. That's not how it works. You're fighting a duel to the extremity, of course you're going to have any weapon you want. And this is just a cool picture from a copy of Bellafortis of guys totally stabbing each other. I think this horse is also like has blood on his teeth. Like this is clearly, they're going all out. The defendant also has to find a field. And this is a very important part of making all of this legal, because if you just go out and fight a duel and you kill somebody, that's murder. However, if you can find a prince who will sponsor a field, so will agree to host the duel, and you can find a judge who will actually, like a judge, sorry, a judicial judge from an actual court, who will supervise the duel, then it goes from being a murder in the street to being a proper legal proceeding. Even though there's no criminal case involved, the judge and the prince are what make it into a proper process in which nobody's guilty of actually doing assault or murder. This is how Talhofer displays a dueling field in the book of René d'Anjou. It's a bit more complicated, with grandstands and multiple layers of fences. In the earlier form of the military duels, in military encampments, the commanders would take the role of both the prince and the judge. But in these civilian duels, they have separate responsibilities. Either one of them can stop the duel at any time just by withdrawing their sponsorship. So there's cases where a prince just, what they say is throwing his scepter into the field is a signal, like a judge dropping the staff, to say, nope, stop fighting, the duel's over, I don't care, go home. This actually happens in one of Fiore de Riveri's students. He mentions a duel between the French Marshal Boucicaut and his student Galeazzo de Mantua. And they actually, it's a duel that might have ended in death, but what happens when they actually start fighting is, I believe, Galeazzo manages to dent Boucicaut's helmet with a blow, and then Boucicaut with his spear, and then Boucicaut grabs his spear and breaks it in half, and then immediately the princes throw in their scepters, and that's the end of the duel, where they just say, okay, you both showed you can do stuff, and then at that point they were forced to hug it out, because the duel was not allowed to continue at that point. And they were instructed to become friends, and that is how they describe it.
Just like in him.
But so the guys up here, the nobility, have the ability to control the duel just by withdrawing consent. And the judge on the field can do the same thing. So if you can't find a prince or you can't find a judge willing to officiate at the crazy duel you want to fight, then there's also the concept what they call going to the woods. And this is a fun quote. Because he says that some say that necessity makes many things lawful which otherwise were unlawful, and for that the sword is judge and manifest witness that he who escapes without hurt should be victorious, and he who is slain or grievously hurt is defeated. And in this way a sentence of victory may be reported without a judge, because the wound's witnessed in place of the judge. So basically, if you can't find a prince and a judge who will sponsor your duel, then some will say, doesn't matter, you still got to fight. So go find a place where no one's going to catch you and settle it quietly. But this interests me especially because if you've read the introduction to Fiore's book, what he mentions is he had to fight 5 times in solitary places with none of his friends around, and he doesn't say what happened in the duel, except that each time he escaped without wounds. So it kind of has an echo of this passage right here, and I wonder if they're both quoting something that I haven't been able to find, because the phrasing is very similar. Fiore doesn't say anything about what happened to the other guy. All he says is, yeah, there was a duel somewhere, and we fought, and I didn't get hurt. Which is a way of removing this, and therefore the other guy was clearly in the wrong each time. After the challenge has been made, the next step is to awaken your sleeping strength, as Pozzo says. And he says that you have to agree on a certain amount of time for training before the duel. which sometimes can be as little as 6 weeks. But he says if it's more than 6 months, then we kind of have to assume you're not actually serious about fighting. So it should be not more than 6 months. And during that time, here's just a nice picture of physical training from an astrology book. There's a picture of the sun god up there that I clipped off. Doing all kinds of fun gymnastics, picking up rocks, throwing sticks, handstands, and so on. There's also an interesting piece about training and so on, which he calls making the fighters equal, which is if the challenger challenges a disabled person, then part of the rules of the duel will be that whatever handicap they have is imposed on the challenger. So if they only have one leg, then he has to have one of his legs tied up. If they only have one arm, and so on, one eye, they have to cover an eye. However, if a challenger has a disability, the defendant doesn't care. Like the basic answer is, well, you shouldn't have challenged someone to a duel if you weren't willing to fight it. Again, the defendant has all the advantages. So whatever disabilities he has gets imposed on the challenger. The challenger doesn't get any benefit like that. And this is just a cool little detail from a manuscript of a one-legged knight who's about to fuck somebody up. A lot of these dueling treatises are obsessed with the question of who gets to attack first. And you can go through like all of these earlier precursors to Pozzo, and they all have detailed opinions of whether the challenger or the defendant should be the one to throw the first strike. John of Legnano argues both sides and then says, you know, really, I guess it's up to other authorities to decide this. Christine de Pizan, who is a French author from about 1420, is very clear to say that this whole conversation is stupid because real fights have no rules. Therefore, the fighters should be allowed to just figure out on their own who's going to strike first. But Pozzo is equally clear when he says it's always the challenger who attacks first. Because it's basically like he is repeating his initial challenge with his weapon. Which means the defendant has to sit there and wait until the challenger either attacks or gives up. Which we did a duel simulation on Oktoberfest one year, and they spent like 15 minutes circling. Because the attacker knew that he was safe until he attacked. And so the other guy was trying to provoke him into attacking for so long. It was so boring. And like the first minute was really tense, and then it just kept going and going and going as he was waiting for his perfect opportunity that never came. But it's interesting to me because when you look at our fencing treatises, very often it involves somebody, it's very clear that you are defending yourself against an attack from your opponent. And the question of why they cover that a lot and they don't cover how to attack in nearly as much detail could partially be because in contexts like this, the attacker and defender roles are very clearly defined. So if you know that your opponent is going to attack you before you can do anything, you're probably going to work really hard on a great response to all kinds of different attacks. Also, sometimes wacky things might be explained. For example, if you're supposed to attack your opponent, but you're not sure you want to actually engage in that way, you can do things like throw something at them to initiate the fight while you're still at a safe distance, and can work out your strategy from there. This is the famous pommel throwing play from Gladiatoria, where he has unscrewed the pommel from his handle, and then he's going to proceed to fight with his spear instead. A lot of times these duels begin by throwing the spear, but if you really want to keep your spear, I guess you can throw your sword and still keep your distance. Pozzo mentions women in dueling very briefly. He says that women who are noble have the authority and the right to challenge a man to a duel. However, they're not allowed to fight the duel. They have to choose a champion for the most misogynistic reasons possible. What he says is because if a woman were to fight a duel with a man and the man wins, then he'll be known as the man who attacked a woman, and that's dishonorable. But if the woman wins, then she'll be taking away honor from the knight as being the man who lost to a woman. And either way, the knight loses. So he says, and that's why women can't fight duels. She has to hire a champion to fight the duel for her. But other dueling authorities would say women can't even issue a challenge. So I guess he's slightly progressive in that way. But yeah, this picture I just showed you is actually a mythological Amazon battle. And here's just women watching as guys go off to fight. So, what we're talking about here is armored dueling. Here's a French dueling code, I guess, which has some cool illustrations. They're showing the beginning of the duel here, where each knight who's going to fight has to be properly shriven and go through their Catholic last rites just in case they die. And then they have to repeat their challenge and the response to the challenge in front of the prince and the judge. And they get to hang out in these little tents until they're ready to go. You can see the normal grandstand up here where everybody's watching, and then the rabble down here who are not fancy nobles and don't get to have the elevated view. Typically these duels would begin on horseback, especially talking about duels to the extremity. You'd have first lances, and then you might go to sword fighting on horseback or grappling. Eventually one or both people will be dismounted by either being unhorsed or voluntarily getting off their horse, and you might have horse versus foot. Then you get to sword fighting on foot and knife fighting on foot, and then go to the ground, somebody gets the crap murdered out of them, and then everyone steals his clothes. They go into a body bag, and Talhalford looks on proudly as the knight thanks Jesus for the victory. Those are pictures from Cal and Fiore de Liberi, and these last few where it gets bloody is of course Talhalford because he has all the best blood. But the question you might be wondering then is, what about blossfechten? What about unarmored fighting? Surely all of the texts we have about longsword fighting are about dueling like this, right? And definitely I have not yet found any evidence of that. And Pozzo says, hell no. He has a whole chapter about unarmored fighting, which is all about why it should never, ever, ever be allowed to happen. Including this story. It brings to mind 2 knights who, having pledged for battle, obtained a field from a prince. They had deliberated in concert to fight unarmed, apart from swords and without any body armor, and with this, each one would show their mettle in defending their cause. In order to defend their lives, they would put themselves in a state such that each had the semblance of a raving dragon. I like the raving dragon part. However, seeing this on the appointed day, the prince did not want battle to be made, saying it was more suitable for vile butchers than for valorous knights. And for this work in sententiousness, the prince was highly praised. The word here for butcher in Italian is actually pimps in Latin. And the only other place where he uses the same terminology is in fact the chapter on Go Into the Woods, which kind of draws together these 2 things that are his most hated practices when it comes to dueling, and suggests there might be a sort of shadow dueling situation that he had heard of, where people would want to fight unarmored with swords, be told no, and then go to the woods, which again puts me in mind of Fiore. Maybe he was one of those vile butchers when he was young and did this kind of activity. There's a couple other, like this chapter has like 4 different anecdotes about unarmored duels that were not allowed to happen, including one, funny enough, that involves 2 Germans who traveled south of the mountains, specifically because they couldn't find anybody who would let them fight this duel in Germany, and they were hoping to find an Italian court that would allow them to fight unarmored, and they also didn't. But apparently Germans really wanted to fight unarmored duels. So now is when shit starts getting weird. Book 8 of Pozzo is all about accounts of actual duels that happened and his opinions about how they should have been judged. So it's 40-something chapters of dueling weirdness. And I'm going to go through a couple of these, give you, the chapter titles are great because they give you like the entire TLDR of the scenario, and then I'll tell you how they get judged. So the first 3 things I read at the beginning of this lecture were actually chapters 1, 2, and 3 of this section of the book. We also have attacking the horse. What happens if you agree to fight on horseback and then someone jumps off their horse and runs up and kills the other guy's horse, which then falls and traps him, and then he kills the guy? Is that a valid victory? And the answer is, If it was a duel to satisfaction, then definitely not. That's murder. However, if it's a duel to the extremity, all's fair in love and war, and you should not have agreed to rules that were not enforceable, like stay on your horse. What happens if you have a duel in which both duelists agree that whoever is unhorsed first will lose the duel, and then in the very first pass they both are unhorsed? And this one's interesting because what he says is that it's the challenger's job is to win, and the defendant's job is merely to not lose. So, or to make the challenger lose. So, if they both fall off at the same time, then the challenger is the one who's always considered the loser, because he didn't actually defeat the defendant properly. So, anytime there's a draw, the defendant wins, unless it's a duel to the extremity, in which case, in the case of like a situation like this, you force them to go home and come back and fight again the next day, until interesting things happen. But what about ninjas? Is everyone familiar with this picture from Fiore, where he has a trick poleaxe that's full of blinding powder that he throws into his opponent's face? Pozzo actually talks about a duel where this happened. And he says, 2 knights, having been challenged to mortal combat with iron-shod maces, entered into the list. One brought a hollowed-out mace, in which cavity he carried full of a pestiferous powder, which, sending it above the visor of his enemy, suddenly deprived him of the sight of his eyes in a manner that he was forced to cover them. And with this malign stratagem, he became the victor, having deprived his enemy of sight and sense. Pozzo was actually really troubled by this. This is one of the longer chapters in this whole section. He goes through like 3 or 4 pages of discussion of like, I don't know, he's talking about like Roman history and Amazon legends and like medieval warfare, and going through, he says, well, I don't know, if this were a normal court case, you couldn't win by blinding the jury, so maybe... And in the end, he refuses to give an actual answer about whether it's valid or not. He says it kind of feels like it's wrong, but I will leave it to other authorities to clarify in the future. He brings up old Lombardic law about using magic powders, and he's like, well, this isn't magic, but it is powder. Yeah, like this one gives him trouble with his rationales about how dueling works. But again, one of the weirdest things in Fiore's fencing manual may actually have happened in a real duel in Italy in the 15th century. He has a whole hierarchy about disarming and wounding, with scenarios about, okay, well, what happens if they're fighting a pass, and one fighter knocks off his opponent's spalder and gauntlet, and the other one knocks off his shield? Who wins? And so he has to give like point values for different pieces of armor. And what he lays out is the most valuable thing is the weapon, followed by the shield, and then the helmet, and then the gauntlet. So again, earlier the gauntlet was the best, now it's in 4th place. However, things like spalders don't matter. You don't get any points for that. So if you're trying to fight a duel to satisfaction and see who got the better hit, then it depends on which part of equipment you manage to damage. He also has a hierarchy of body parts, because there's like 5 different chapters that are like, okay, well, one guy gets stabbed, gets his eye stabbed out, and the other guy gets his nose cut off. Which one's worse? One guy gets hit in the arm, one guy gets hit in the leg. Which one's worse? And he said, and things like that. But he says that the arm is a much better hit than the leg. However, on facial wounds, the eye is the best place to hit your opponent, but only if you don't otherwise scar their face, because the face is made in the image of God. Therefore, you're dishonoring yourself by defacing somebody. However, if you can stab out their eye without affecting the rest of their face, that's the best possible way to hit them. Yeah, this gets really convoluted really fast. It's almost like he's designing a role-playing game. But based on different like outcomes of jousts and duels that actually happened. Then he goes on to give a scenario where somebody manages to disarm their opponent of his sword, and then the guy with no sword continues to fight for the rest of the day until sunset, without having any resolution to the duel. And the guy who got the disarm then wants to claim victory because he had the most important act. And Pozzo at this point introduces the rule of cool, where he says, yeah, ordinarily taking the guy's sword is a really impressive feat. However, fighting with no sword against a swordsman for hours is also really cool. And actually, I think that makes him the better knight at the end of the day, because he managed to do an almost impossible feat of martial skill. And like I said, one of the justifications of this entire kind of dueling is that the person who is the better knight and the better warrior is probably the correct one in the dispute. So by showing that he could fight that well against a sword, he clearly is the one who should be winning. He has a section on wounding the hand where he says, basically, when a lefty fights with a righty and both are wounded in the hand, which will be the more honorable, victor or loser or equal. And the details are, you have a left-handed guy and a right-handed guy, both of whom have their right hands injured. And they both injured on their dominant hand, sorry. So the righty gets his right hand cut and the lefty gets his left hand cut. And the left-handed fencer or fighter wants to declare victory because he says, oh, I hit his right hand, which is the important one. I only got hit in the left hand. So clearly I hit him way better than he hit me. And Pozzo's like, no, no, no. The left hand is the right hand of a left-handed person. Which is one of my favorite justifications of all time. Therefore, both hits are equal. And also, come on guys, fighting takes two hands and everybody knows that. So whether you're right-handed or left-handed, you're still using both of them. So therefore, both hands should be judged equal. And this is a picture from Talhofer of a guy getting his hand cut off with a cool little mace that's holding a different, smaller weapon. I love that thing. If you want to hit somebody with a knife being held by a tiny hand, that's the weapon for you. What about alchemy? I don't have a fencing manual picture to illustrate this one, but he has a great little scenario where a guy shows up in the field with like a backpack full of little metal spheres that have some kind of concoction in them where he throws them on the ground and they shoot fire out of little holes in the sphere. So he has a bag of fireballs, and he goes out and starts throwing them in front of the other guy's horse, and the horse keeps spooking and running away. And he keeps this up for a while until the guy... Kendra, you're giving me a look.
I didn't mean to, sorry.
Am I telling this one wrong?
Fine.
Okay. And then, like, he spends, like, all morning doing this until finally, like, when the fight stops and the guy's saying, come on, guys, this is totally not fair. He can't keep doing this, right? And this goes back to... Oh, shit, I forget how this one was judged. Kendra, do you remember?
I can look it up. Also, we have this room until noon, so if we want to do story time after lecture, we can just do that.
So my co-presenter, Kendra, has arrived. We really thought we were on 11:30, so we were ready to spend like the last hour reviewing our slides and making a plan. So I'm giving you the version of this lecture before her parts were added in. But she has a bunch, her role was going to be to do primary source readings and give you some actual accounts that Pozzo gives of some of these duels.
Do you want to just read this one rather than try to skim it and find it?
So this will give you a taste of like how Pozzo actually describes some of these things.
Of a certain knight that brought a ball of artificial fire to the field, which cast upon the ground kept back the enemy's horse. Chapter 34. A knight called to combat for life upon breach of faith, or defiance of honor, or some other just occasion, presents himself with lance and sword to maintain the quarrel upon the defender, and, coming into the lists, finds that the defender there has certain balls of steel full of small holes, and within them burning fire, which balls he threw upon the ground and stayed behind them.